U.S. President Joe Biden has insisted that he is not dropping out of the presidential race and that he's in good health for another term in office. But former President Donald Trump is marginally leading in the polls. So what's next in this turbulent presidential race? We're joined by Clayton Allen, Director of U.S. at Eurasia Group. Clayton, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You say that President Biden's position is increasingly tenuous. Do you think, in fact, that he might say, I'll have to drop out?
We don't, and the simple reason is no one can convince Biden that he is not the strongest candidate to beat Trump. He thinks of himself as the only guy who can bring everyone together. He looks at 2016 when he was talked out of running against Trump as sort of the biggest disappointment in his career. It's going to be very hard for anyone outside of maybe his wife and his son to convince him that he should step aside in this race.
He's taking advice from Hunter. Some people might be Hunter's had his troubles, legal troubles and drug addiction troubles, but let's not dwell on that. Power brokers in the party, like Representative James Clyburn and the Senate Majority Leader, Mr. Schumer, what do you think they're telling Biden right now behind closed doors?
So what they're telling behind closed doors doesn't matter as much. It's what they do in public. And House Democrats, the Democratic Party really learned the lesson of noted political commentator Omar Little from The Wire. If you're going to come at the king, you best not miss. And earlier today, they had a call among all House Democrats, a meeting actually, to try and find some sort of coordinated message. They couldn't come together and find a public position, a public platform, pressuring Biden to step down. Members might tell him privately, look, I have concerns, but that's not going to do much to sway the mind of a guy who, for the last 50 years, has felt like he's been underestimated in Washington, that he's proved everybody wrong, and that he's going to prove them wrong again in November.
It's a dramatic story. But you do think that Biden's position when he meets, for example, with NATO allies is weakened here?
I think it is. Look, it's the question of the future. NATO allies came to Washington this week looking at Biden as someone who faces a much harder path to re-election. Their expectations about Biden's political fortune speaks volumes about their outlook for the U.S. durability within NATO, U.S. security commitments in the transatlantic relationship, and to put it simply, it's going to be hard for Biden to convince U.S. allies that there's a long-term U.S. commitment for funding Ukraine, for continuing U.S. military presence in Europe, when his replacement at this point looks like Donald Trump.
I mean, you would say that, I mean, the polls are one thing, they've been wrong in the past, but you think that Trump has a very good chance of winning in November?
We do. Look, polls have been wrong in the past. Polls have been wrong, almost as often as they've been right in the last decade. But right now, Trump is leading uniformly in the ones that we think matter. Top issue polling. Voters are telling you he does better on the economy, immigration, law and order. Swing state polling. Trump is looking pretty strong in the states that are going to be the deciding factor in this election. And for Biden, who looks at this as a weaker candidate than he did even 2-3 weeks ago, it's going to be hard for him to make up that ground. Eurasia Group puts about 25% chances on Biden's winning, and that means that Trump has a 75% chance of victory at this point.
Oh, my goodness. So this sounds like bad news for Ukraine in its fight with Russia.
It could be. I mean, look, Trump winning doesn't necessarily mean that U.S. aid to Ukraine drops off immediately. There's a number of different programs that could keep military aid funding. Ownership of the Ukraine Contact Group is moving to NATO away from the U.S., so Trump's ability to impact every aspect of U.S. military aid to NATO might be a little bit limited, but ultimately he's going to favor curtailing some of that aid. Our expectation is that he pulls the U.S. back in an effort to try and force negotiations around a ceasefire. That's maybe bad news if your outlook from Kyiv is that you want to have continued support to end the war only on your terms.
So what about the U.S. economy here? There's a perception that Mr. Trump, if he becomes president again, will cut taxes and won't be worried about narrowing the deficit.
That's 100% true. It's not that he's going to cut taxes, it's that he's going to keep the tax cuts which are currently in place going. Remember, they expire at the end of 2025. He's going to extend all of them, or at least most of them. That's going to be a pretty massive hit to U.S. revenues. The estimates from CBO and others peg that at between $3 and $4 trillion. All of that would accrue to the deficit. The thing to remember, though, is that U.S. deficits are going up whether or not Trump wins. Under Biden, you'd see a lot of those same tax cuts extended. You'd see child care tax credits extended, and you'd see domestic spending increase as well. So for U.S. deficit numbers, that's an upward trajectory regardless of who's in the White House, and there's no political incentive, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, to change that.
No, so the American voters, they're willing to accept these huge deficits?
It's not an issue that's immediately salient for voters. Voters look at the economy. They look at their individual outcomes as the biggest driver of their voting activity. Deficits are kind of this hard to pin down sort of nebulous concept that until it impacts mortgage rates, until it impacts the interest rates, until it impacts everyday life and the sort of the realized reality of the U.S. economy, if you will, it's not something that voters are really going to be changing their minds over.
What are voters most concerned about? Is it inflation?
That's absolutely true. Look, I think it was James Carville that said that 9 out of 10 U.S. elections are decided on people's pocketbooks and cost of living. That's absolutely true. People look at gas prices, food prices, home prices, and they say the cumulative inflation over the last 4 to 5 years, really since the end of COVID lockdowns, is probably the biggest motivating factor in voter behavior this year. That's been the biggest headwind for the Biden campaign because you look at economic data that's been generally positive. Inflation is cooling, wage growth is up, unemployment is relatively steady despite some bad numbers earlier today. Those things aren't breaking through. It's inflation that's really telling the economic story to the U.S. voter.
You mentioned James Carville, the former Bill Clinton strategist. He likes to be provocative, but you may have seen that op-ed he wrote in the New York Times. Carville said, Biden is going to be out of the presidential race. It's only a matter of time before Democratic pressure and public and private polling lead him to exit. But do you think Carville is overstating it there?
I would never say that James Carville has overstated anything. I respect James Carville immensely. I think he is absolutely a top-notch political commentator. I think that what his viewpoint is the one that's shared by a lot of very informed outside observers, and they're looking at this and saying a rational case as a candidate for Biden to remain in the race, in their view, is not there. I would say that our view is pretty similar. Biden's not a strong candidate right now, but look at it through the eyes of the man making the decision. And make no mistake, Joe Biden is the only person who will be deciding whether or not he stays in this race, and he is very dug into his position.
Is that right? They can't, even if there was a major consensus in the Democratic Party telling President Biden to quit the race, he could hang on?
I mean, that's a pretty extreme hypothetical. A major
Yes.
consensus in the party at this point seems pretty hard to reach. Yes. The meeting earlier today was all aimed at striking that, and there's just not consensus among people willing to go publicly and say, look, it's time for the president to step aside. No one wants to be the person who suffers the downside of advocating for a replacement. You get ostracized within the party, you nuke your chances at being the nominee in 2028. And make no mistake, if you're the only person who comes out of leadership and says Biden should step aside, you'll be ostracized by the majority of the party unless everyone else comes along with you.